Did you know that half of England is owned by just 1% of its population, with the public only having access to around 8% of our own countryside? For centuries, land has been stripped away from us, locked away behind barbed wire fences and no trespassing signs. And it's not even just in England that this is the case, although a lot of people argue that it is from England that the concept of private ownership of common land first spread and festered. From common pasture land to forests to whole countries, borders have been erected, and planet Earth has been taken away from the average person, piece by piece. But should these borders even exist? Should land be owned at all? And what would a world without borders look like? Feudalism was a system across the UK and a lot of medieval Europe, where lords and nobles controlled the land. The people who lived on that land were called serfs and had to pay the lords and nobles rent, taxes, tithes and unpaid labour. In the early 1300s, commoners started rebelling against this system by refusing to submit to unpaid labour and rejecting taxes and tithes. This evolved into organised resistance. But these rebellions had little success until the Black Death began breaking out in 1347, which killed many people and made labour very scarce, meaning the commoners had a lot more bargaining power on their side. By the 1400s, these rebellions became wars, as the commoners and peasants wanted to put an end to the power of the lords. Their movement succeeded in destroying serfdom across most of Europe and England. Serfs became free farmers, with free access to the commons, such as to use pastures for grazing, forests for hunting and timber, and waterways for fishing and irrigation. The peasants began building a cooperative, egalitarian society rooted in local self-sufficiency. This period saw their welfare increasing massively, and also saw a rise in ecological regeneration, as lords no longer put pressure on the workers to extract as much as they physically could from the land. Unfortunately though, this utopia didn't last long. The elites of Europe soon cracked down on all the benefits the peasants had gained for themselves. Nobles united with the church and the merchant bourgeoisie to end peasant autonomy and drive wages back down. To do so, they forced the peasants off their land and fenced off and privatised the commons for elite use, turning them into property. This process was violent, often leading to villages being razed, and was called the enclosure of the commons. Organised peasant rebellions were bloody and unsuccessful. In the end, millions of people were removed from their lands, triggering an internal refugee crisis. As locked out of the commons, many were left without homes and food. The word poverty finally came into common use.
We've got nowhere else to go.
This enclosure of the commons became the start of the rise of capitalism. European elites appropriated huge amounts of land and resources. Without access to the commons, peasants were forced to sell their labour to earn a wage, simply in order to survive. And thus capitalism was born out of the ashes of organised violence, mass poverty, the enclosure of the commons, and destruction of self-sufficiency. We all know the rest of the story. The Industrial Revolution later took off, and capitalism evolved into what we know it as today. But it wasn't just in the UK and Europe that the enclosure of land was happening. In fact, many theorise that the enclosure movement, as it began in Europe, spread like a virus across most of the rest of the world, by colonists who journeyed to the Americas, Oceania, India, and even further afield, bringing with them the idea of borders, fences, enclosure, and exclusive access. In his book Property and Dispossession, Alan Greer says that indigenous American communities, pre-colonisation, already had demarcations of commons, as well as some minimal forms of enclosure. For example, around the great cities of Mesoamerica, agricultural plots were carefully measured and marked off, whilst there may also have been differences between an inner commons of croplands, plots and households, and outer commons of forests and mountains. But as colonisers started to form colonies, they began to set up cleared, ploughed and more or less enclosed farms, as well as colonial commons, areas within which settlers could hunt, forage and graze their own livestock. According to Greer, colonists also introduced domestic animals, which they regarded as property wherever those animals went, which was very different to how many indigenous people felt that non-human creatures fit into common property arrangements. In fact, it was this letting loose of cattle, sheep, foraging pigs, horses, and other exotic animals that led to the dislodging of many indigenous communities. Domestic animals, either feral or attended by herders, spread out across colonial commons in advance of their settlement, across both North America and South Africa. Even in Australia in the 19th century, sheep raisers drove their herds onto what was regarded as Great Interior Common Pasture, regardless of the prior claims of Aboriginal foragers. This advancement of domestic animals across the world thus caused the erosion of many formerly stewarded common lands. But in addition to the spread of livestock, many more direct forms of enclosure were carried out by European colonists. In New Spain specifically, the colonists' expansionist phase was followed by a period of enclosure, which caused the hacienda, a large estate or plantation with a house, to dominate major parts of Mexico. Haciendas, according to Greer, were never about land alone, but represented a system of control over space, water, and people. By depriving indigenous populations of their means of subsistence, colonists created their own cheap and compliant labour force, very similarly to how European elites had done so with the peasants of England during the English enclosure movements. And once again, we all know the story after that. Just as colonists were motivated to colonize by the profit it would bring them, profit also motivated the escalation of monopolization, as industrial capitalism reared its ugly head across the globe. The earth was parcelled off and haggled over, bought and traded between private corporations and states, rich individuals and ancient family names. Someone once asked the 6th Duke of Westminster how young entrepreneurs could succeed in modern-day Britain. His answer was very telling. Make sure they have an ancestor who was a very close friend of William the Conqueror. Yeah, and it's not just here in England where being successful under capitalism is made a whole lot easier if you're well connected with someone rich or who has an ancient family name. The source of that wealth usually can be traced back to them being the owners of some kinds of means of production, which further back can probably be traced to the ownership of land. Because ultimately, where do we get food, metals, minerals, water, and space on which we can build, if not from land? But of course, humans haven't always seen land as a commodity, as something to be haggled over and sold off to the highest bidder. And zooming out even further, across the vast tapestry of social constructs that feed into land ownership, even borders, nation-states, and private property haven't really been around very long in the grand scheme of things. Sure, it's very debated when exactly private property first emerged, when the first nation-state became a thing, and what the first border was. And I'm no historian, so I'm not even going to try and wade my way through the messy tangle of theories and academic catfights I'd have to wade through to find concrete answers to any of the above. But I think it's safe to say that at many points throughout history, various peoples in various different societies shared land communally, hence the idea of the commons. People innately have the ability to share and cooperate, to make sure that both their own individual needs are met, and also that the needs of their communities are met too. Unfortunately, across most of the world, that is no longer the world we live in today. For a start, much of our land has become private property. And as long as private property exists, there will always be an incentive for people to appropriate wealth, to buy up land and establish more private property, to further grow their own wealth and power. To return land to the commons, there is no other way about it. We'd have to abolish private property. When talking about private property here, I don't mean your personal property, like your toothbrush, or even the place which you call home, unless that place is, of course, a sprawling countryside estate. And I'm not even talking about the private garden where you like to unwind and find some peace and relaxation on a weekend. In a future anarchist or solarpunk society, under usufruct, everyone would have the rights to enjoy and use the fruits of something, but not to destroy or abuse it. Thus, if you were using your home, you could see yourself as being some kind of steward of it, or even having personal ownership of it, for lack of a better term. At the end of the day, different communities would organise themselves differently and deal with the issue of housing in different ways, making sure everyone's needs were met and everyone had access to adequate housing should they want it. Because the thing is, guys, even on our tiny island of Britain, we do have the space for everyone to have a home which meets their needs. That is the whole point of trying to reform land ownership. Making sure everyone has the space to meet their needs and desires, rather than less than 1% of the country having far f***ing more than their fair share, which most of the time they don't even personally use. So when I talk about private property in this case, I'm talking about something which can be used as a means of production, like a factory, or that can generate a profit, like a large estate of land. Private property should be returned into common ownership, with communities deciding for themselves what they'd like to do with that land or that building to meet their own needs. Whether that's nature-friendly farming, building nature-friendly and comfortable homes, or keeping that area for nature. In a solarpunk or anarchist society, communities would decide what to do with any land through horizontally organised decision-making, whether that would be by consent, by consensus, or purely organically, as and when issues arise and needs needed to be met. As Peter Gelderloos says in his book Anarchy Works, all people are capable of self-organisation, whether or not they are experienced in political work. Of course, taking control of our lives isn't easy at first, but it is imminently possible. Of course, this would extend out beyond just one country. As in a solarpunk anarchist world, we wouldn't have borders at all. Borders themselves being just the boundaries between nation-states as decided by kings or emperors or feuding families centuries ago. I mean, really, if we sit down and think about it, what purpose do borders between nations serve, except to further wealth inequality between peoples, wage war and violence, or allow whichever leader is in power at the time to swing their dick around at the rest of the world? In their essay Borders, the Global Caste System, Crime Thinks say that the border is not just a wall or a line on a map. It's a power structure, a system of control. The border is everywhere that people live in fear of deportation, everywhere migrants are denied the rights accorded citizens, everywhere human beings are segregated into included and excluded. The border divides the whole world into gated communities and prisons, one within the other in concentric circles of privilege and control. At one end of the continuum, there are billionaires who can fly anywhere in private jets. At the other end, inmates in solitary confinement. As long as there is a border between you and those less fortunate than you, you can be sure there will be a border above you too, keeping you from the things you need. They then go on to say, "Speak of freedom all you like, we live in a world of walls. There used to be few enough that we could keep up with them. Hadrian's Wall, the Great Wall of China, the Berlin Wall. Now they're everywhere." I feel like this is quite an accurate summary of borders. I mean, just as fences and walls and anti-trespass signs have been erected across the British countryside to keep the non-elite rabble out, so too have larger fences and walls just been drawn across parcels of land to divide and conquer. I don't want to just stop at a world where people are merely just allowed into their local commons again. I want to keep going, to build a world where borders are deconstructed one by one. A world where walls are torn down and hierarchies are dismantled. I want to reclaim Earth, because why should any of our planet be gate-kept from anyone? After all, we are all citizens and stewards of this Earth, brought onto it through no choice of our own. I mean, as far as we are aware in this current human form, I do realise that a lot of people may believe differently to this. Why should we not have access to all of the Earth? I want access to all of the Earth, and I want everyone to have access to it all too. And I really don't think it's that unreasonable to demand such a thing. In his book Who Owns England, Guy Shrubsole proposes 10 demands for land reform in England, in order for British people to once again be able to have access to the British countryside. 1. End the secrecy around land ownership, so who owns what land is once again public information. This is a point that particularly applies to England, as a lot of other countries, especially in Europe, already have public databases of this kind of information. 2. Fix the housing crisis by stopping landowners from hoarding land and leaving homes empty, by allowing local councils to buy land cheaply and hiking up taxes on homes that have been vacant for more than 2 years. 3. Stop handouts of farming subsidies to wealthy landowners simply because they own land. 4. End unsustainable land use such as grouse shooting, which is a particular problem in the UK as it means 500,000 acres every year are burnt just to promote the habitat of the grouse, which are then shot anyway as a hobby by rich people. 5. Abolish the last vestiges of feudalism that remain in England, such as by closing the loopholes which allow large landowners to avoid inheritance tax. 6. Curb the ways that corporate capitalism uses land to avoid tax, by banning companies and trusts registered in offshore tax havens from owning land and property in England. 7. Stop the privatisation of public sector land and property, and pressure the government to provide land for people to use in the form of council housing, allotments, or nature-friendly farms. 8. Let communities take back control of local land, such as by giving everybody a statutory right to have an allotment, and introducing strong community right-to-buy legislation across England. 9. Open up the countryside to everyone by introducing right-to-roam legislation. And 10. Lastly, introduce a new land ethic, where owning land also comes with responsibilities, so those that own land also have to be stewards of it. Listen, I think all of these ideas sound really great in the context of our current system, but that's where their greatness ends. The truth is, I don't think the question of land ownership is going to be solved under our current system, because how is a capitalist government focused on economic growth and supported by those very aristocrats who own most of our land going to agree to tax them and curb short-term profit? How is a country so shaped by its history of aristocracy and control over its people, not to mention the colonisation it then inflicted across much of the rest of the globe, going to suddenly go, oh yeah, shit, you were right all along, let's suddenly give up all our wealth and just hand over the land back to the people? Yeah, it's likely not. To be honest, I think that any of these changes, if made at all, would take years of campaigning and policy making to even just be considered. And we simply just don't have that time. The widening gap of wealth inequality, the escalation of the climate crisis and ecological collapse. We cannot wait around for the government to decide that they are going to let us reclaim our commons. And further than that, what about the rest of the world? The toxic ideas that England has helped to spread, such as of land ownership and the enclosure of the commons, have now reached tendrils out across the rest of Earth, brought there in part by our colonisation as well as the progression of capitalism, to tackle the enclosure of the commons and ensure all peoples have unlimited access, once again, to common resources on a global scale. We need to push the boat further in rethinking our attitudes towards ownership, properties and borders, not just come up with a few slightly modified policies that still fit neatly under capitalism. And that's where anarchism comes in. No, but seriously, it's times like these where I feel like people are always missing the last piece of the puzzle, or maybe they're just too scared to call a spade. Because how can you look at all this and not realise that hierarchy is the problem here? It was the hierarchy between the elites of Europe and the peasants of Europe which allowed them to bring about the enclosure of the commons. And it was hierarchy that allowed those same European elites, through colonisation, to bring the ideas of land ownership and enclosure of the commons to a lot of the rest of the world. Hierarchy of any kind is the problem here. As long as it is present in the form of a state, or of wealth and resource inequality, or even within the vestiges of feudalist aristocracy, there will always be incentives for those with power and money to enclose and monopolise land to further build that power and money. I often feel like it's the capitalist class that have drilled into us this belief that we are powerless, and only the experts under the hierarchies that we live in, like our leaders, can make big decisions for us, especially when it comes to important things like how land is used. But in an anarchist or solarpunk society where we take back control over land use, this wouldn't mean we'd suddenly all be running around like headless chickens without any knowledge or expertise to know what to do with the land around us. There would still be committees of experts which would help with guidance and expertise, like committees of ecologists identifying which land would be best to keep aside for rewilding, or committees of farmers identifying which land has the best soil for farming. The important thing here is that these committees would not have a de facto hierarchy to be able to just fence off that land and ban anyone else from stepping near it, as is the case today. A horizontally organised, anti-hierarchical world does not mean regressing to a place where we know less. It would just be a place where we could get to decide what to do with the land ourselves, how we could use it to most benefit our communities. Anyway, as outlined in the previous sections of this video, without disrupting the ideas of private property, capitalism and borders, and building a truly horizontal, anti-hierarchical anarchist society, there would be no reason for individuals not to once again want to grow their wealth and power by finding new and innovative ways to enclose common land. We wouldn't be able to build a truly solarpunk world, where all people have access to their needs and desires, as well as to all of Earth. So how do we reclaim Earth? In theory, how would we start to reclaim our land, abolish borders, and disrupt the ideas of private property? I'm obviously not suggesting that anyone breaks their local laws nor compromises their safety, but the following are just a few abstract ideas of ways in which previous groups or movements have regained access to common land and property. 1. Trespass. Trespass is where people enter land or property that is not owned by them. In England specifically, there is a movement called Right to Roam, where local groups trespass onto estates or other land as part of their campaigning to reopen up the British countryside. 2. Guerrilla gardening. Guerrilla gardening is where local groups of people will plant native and also often edible plants in unused spaces in their communities, so that their communities have better food resilience and access to nature and food. 3. Squatting. Squatting is a method by which groups occupy uninhabited land, properties or buildings. So what do you think about borders and private property? And how do you think we should manage land use and access in a solarpunk world? Let me know in the comments down below. See you in the next one. Bye!